In today's cosplay tutorial video, I'm going to show you how I made my Flayn cosplay from Fire Emblem Three Houses. For Flayn's outfit, I'm going to be using this pattern from Indigo Patterns. It is a digital print-at-home pattern. So you start by printing out the first page, making sure the key is to scale, then print out the rest of the pages, tape them together, and cut them out. I cut the dress pieces out of a black cotton sateen, and then for the lining, I'm using some dark blue cotton. I used a pencil to trace the front design out onto the paper side of some heat and bond. You may have noticed that I'm not tracing all the way around the design. I'm just roughly going about the middle of the outer edge of the design. Iron the heat and bond onto the back side of some dark blue satin, and trim away the excess material. The paper backing can be peeled away, revealing the adhesive underneath. I used the paper pattern as a guideline of where to place the patch. I ironed the patch to activate the adhesive and attach it to the bodice, but I also used some stitching along the outer edge just for further security. Since the pattern included the vector files, I decided to go ahead and use heat transfer vinyl for the gold detailing. I also just wanted to see how it would work layered with the heat and bond, and it worked pretty well, though you can see the stitching through it. So if this was a competition piece, I probably would remake this panel, but since it's not, I'm probably not going to worry about it. Sew the front bodice piece to the side front bodice pieces. Repeat the process for the bodice back. You can see on these that I did not do the stitching on the satin applique, and it does make a little bit of a difference. Sew the front and back pieces together along the shoulder seams and the side seams. For the skirt, once again, I cut the outer pieces out of the cotton sateen and regular cotton for the lining. The only difference is that there is a panel in the center front of the skirt, and for the outer portion of that, I cut it out of some dark blue satin. Sew the blue panel in between the two side front pieces. For the 3 stripes on the front of her skirt, the pattern instructions used satin stitching. I decided to use some trim that I had in my stash, and you may notice that this looks a little different, and that's because I had to remake this panel because the first time it ended up looking really wobbly and the satin was not cooperating. So I redid it using interfacing on the back of the blue panel, and that did make a difference. Sew the skirt pieces together and add the details just like we did for the bodice. For the gold stripe at the top of her skirt, I sewed on some gold trim, and as I was sewing, I also added a tassel. Sew the skirt onto the bodice. Since there's so much bulk at the waist here, I found it easier to sew them together while using a zipper foot on my machine. Repeat the same process to create the dress lining, just without all of the fancy details. Sew the dress and the lining together at the neckline, and we're going to edge stitch the seam allowance towards the lining to encourage it to turn inward. Sew a separating zipper into the back of the bodice. Now, this zipper is only sewn to the black fabric, and it's not sewn to the lining yet. I did struggle with this a little bit. It's definitely better on one side versus the other. I might clean it up a little bit by hand when I'm sewing the lining in, but hopefully it won't be super noticeable. Sew the skirt and skirt lining pieces together from the end of the zipper down around the bottom, back up to the other end of the zipper, then edge stitch and turn right side out. Then we're going to hand sew the lining to the zipper. Sew the lining and the outer fabric together along the armhole. For the sleeve flounce, I was worried the pattern was going to be a little too long, so I did trim away at the bottom. Hopefully I don't regret that later. Then I cut 4 of the lining out of the blue satin and 4 of the outer out of the black fabric. Then we're going to match up right sides together and sew them together along the sides. Putting right sides together, sew the blue and black flounce pieces together along the bottom edge. Then we're going to turn it right side out and sew some gathering stitches along the top. Cut 2 of the wristband pieces out of the blue satin, 2 of them out of the black fabric, and on the black ones we're going to apply some fusible interfacing. Then fold them in half and sew them together. Sew the black side of the cuff and the blue side of the cuff together along the top, sandwiching the ruffle in between. I then turned the cuff pieces right side out and sewed them together. I realized that the sleeve middle piece was going to be too long for my arms, so I did make some adjustments to it. The first was to trim off the seam allowance at the bottom, and this isn't as big of a deal because everything's going to be gathered down, so I don't have to worry about it fitting exactly. The other thing was, since I need the top to fit exactly, I couldn't cut anything off of that. So instead I cut it in the middle, scrunched the two pieces together by 2 inches, and then trimmed off the excess so it was one smooth line on either side. This does mean that I end up sacrificing a bit of the volume at the bottom of the sleeve, but for me it was worth it. I repeated the same process with the sleeve middle lining. This way the changes would be proportional to both the lining and the outer part. Cut out 2 of the sleeve and 2 of the sleeve lining. Then again, we're going to fold them in half and sew them together along the sides. Sew gathering stitches along the bottom of both the main sleeve and the main sleeve lining. Gather and sew the outer part of the sleeve to the sleeve cuff. Gather the lining of the sleeve and, putting right sides together, sew that to the blue side of the cuff. There is a lot of gathering going on here. Turn the sleeve right side out and sew the outer sleeve to the lining together along the top. Cut 2 of the bicep bands out of the blue cotton for the lining and 2 of them out of the gold satin. For those, I applied some fusible interfacing and also sewed on a line of trim. Then we're going to fold them in half and sew them together. Putting right sides together, sew the golden cuff to the top of the sleeve. Cut 2 of the sleeve puff outer out of the black fabric and 2 of the sleeve puff lining out of the blue cotton. Then we're going to fold them in half and sew them together along the sides. On just the black puff sleeve, we're going to sew some gathering stitches along the top from the notches to the other notch and all the way along the bottom. Gather the black sleeve puff and sew it to the golden cuff. Sew the puff lining to the bicep cuff. Putting right sides together, sew the bicep cuff and bicep cuff lining together. And now we have 2 base sleeves. Sew the sleeves to the bodice, but just the outer fabric, not the lining. Trim away the excess seam allowance between the notches. Then hand sew the lining of the sleeve into place, tucking the raw edges inward so you have a nice clean finish. Cut 4 of the base bow piece out of some gold satin and on 2 of them apply some fusible interfacing. Then, matching an interfaced and non-interfaced piece, we're going to sew them together all along the outer edge, leaving a space open so it can be turned right side out. Okay, so the sleeve bows are just not working, and this isn't a problem with the pattern, this is just the fabric I'm using. It just frays so easily that anytime I clip the seam allowances to try and have nice crisp bows, it just frays. So we're going to scrap these, and instead I'm using some satin ribbon that is close in color to the gold fabric. So instead I simply tied some bows out of the ribbon and hand sewed them onto the sleeves. And with that, Flayn's base dress is done. Cut 2 of the skirt pieces out and serge along the edges. Alternatively, you could use pinking shears or a zigzag stitch, whatever you prefer. Putting right sides together, sew the skirt pieces together along the side seams. Cut 4 of the skirt ruffle pieces, and again, I serge the edges to help keep them from fraying. Sew all of the ruffle pieces together to make one long loop. Then we're going to finish the bottom edge using a rolled hem and sew some gathering stitches along the top. Gather the ruffle and sew it to the bottom of the skirt. I realized that the instructions have you putting the waistband on first, but oh well. Speaking of the waistband, we're going to put right sides together and sew it together along the shorter side. Turn the waistband right side out and press it in half. I also folded one of the sides in by the seam allowance and pressed that as well. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the non-folded side of the waistband to the top of the skirt. Then fold over the waistband and sew it into place, leaving a space open so we can insert the elastic. Thread the elastic through the waistband and sew the 2 ends together. Pull the elastic back into the channel and sew the hole closed. And with that, we have a finished underskirt. Cut 2 of the top bow pieces out of some dark blue satin, and on one of them apply some fusible interfacing. Putting right sides together, sew the top bow pieces together along the outer edge, leaving a space open so it can be turned right side out. Turn it right side out and hand sew the hole closed. Gather the middle of the bow down and hand sew it into place. Cut 2 of the second bow piece out of the blue satin, and on one of them apply some fusible interfacing. Putting right sides together, sew the bow pieces together all around the outer edge, leaving a space open so it can be turned right side out. Turn it right side out and hand sew the hole closed. Pleat the bow following the markings on the pattern. For the third bow piece, we're going to cut 2 out of gold and 2 out of blue. And on the blue, we're going to apply some fusible interfacing. Putting right sides together, sew the blue and gold pieces together at the centers. Putting right sides together, sew the bow pieces together along the outer edge, leaving a space open so it can be turned right side out. Turn the piece right side out and hand sew the hole closed. Then we're going to pleat the bow piece. To be honest, I've probably pleated this about 30 times. I don't know why I keep struggling with it, but I decided to just call it good enough and press it down. The pattern piece itself says to cut 2 of the wrap pieces out of the blue fabric, but the instructions made it seem like you only needed 1, so that's what I did. Fold the knot piece in half and sew it together along the long side. Turn the knot right side out and press it flat. Stack the bow pieces together and wrap the knot piece around the center. Then hand sew it into place, also adding on a pin so it can be attached to the dress. And here is the bow all complete. Cut the collar pieces out twice, and on half of them apply some fusible interfacing. Putting right sides together, sew the front and back collar pieces together along the shoulder seams. Sew the neck piece to the collar for both the outer and lining pieces. Then we're going to clip open the seam allowance and press it. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the lining to the outer portion of the collar, all along the pointed edge and along the curved top edge. We're going to leave the ends open, and I also folded them down so that there will be no raw edges when we turn it right side out. Turn the collar right side out and top stitch all along the outer edge. This will serve to close the hole in the back as well. For the closures at the back of the collar, the pattern instructions call for using hook and eyes, but I decided to use snaps instead, also because I found that the collar was a little loose on me, and I wanted it to overlap so it would be a little bit tighter. And now we have a finished collar. For Flayn's hair clips, I 3D printed them using a file from Dangerous Ladies. However, alternatively, you could sculpt them out of foam clay. I primed and sanded the pieces, then spray painted them gold. For the back side of the hair clips, I used a 2-part epoxy to attach some clips to them. Unfortunately, because of the curvature of the clip, they didn't stay very well, so I did end up going back and using hot glue to attach them, which surprisingly worked better. I repeated the process 3 more times. For 2 of them, I used the epoxy to attach some pin backs to the back on 2 places, and these are going to attach to the bow. And then on the last one, I just added 1 pin back, and this will be used for the brooch. For Flayn staff, I'm using a 3D file from the Dangerous Ladies, and I printed it out, and then it's all on a wooden rod that goes down the middle, and everything is glued together with 2-part epoxy. That's why I'm outside. When I was doing it, I was using a respirator because this stuff is not good for you. I then primed it, put some Bondo on it, sanded it, primed it again, did a little bit more sanding. I used 2 different types of primers, and as you can see, it's got this weird cracking, but I'm so close to my deadline, I'm just gonna move ahead and go on with the painting. It's unfortunate that this isn't the sort of the creator where the cracking would look really cool, so I'll put that back in the back of my mind for maybe when I make that. Spray painted the middle section white. I used painter's tape to mask off the area that I wanted to keep white, and painted the rest gold. Peel off the tape to reveal the white paint underneath. Lastly, I finish off the staff by gluing on this red ball at the end. This was printed and primed and painted separately so that I didn't have to worry about masking off the entire staff just for this little piece. And that means the costume is now complete. And now for the reveal. Overall, I'm really happy with how this costume turned out. I still do need a bit more practice with heat transfer vinyl and with finishing 3D printed pieces, but for the short time span that I made it in, I'm quite proud of it, and hope you enjoy this video as well. Thank you so much for watching, and if there are any Fire Emblem cosplays you'd like to see me make, let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much. Bye.